Where possible, I think it's good to look for topics that are maybe very specifically related to maybe the questions that Noahides face, but I think also there's more generally maybe a category of topics that's like things the Torah has to teach us that are very much kind of the message for everyone, as opposed to kind of the particulars of keeping all the mitzvot to the Torah or something. Especially in Genesis, there's a lot of stuff where I think it's worldview, right? It's about what is it to see the world through the eyes of someone who recognizes Hashem as king, and that's certainly a question as much for Bnei Noach as for Jews.
I agree. You know, that is probably one of the bigger questions that come up usually dealing with newly converted Noahides, or however you want to say it, new to the Noahide faith, or they want to know what am I supposed to study? So a lot of times we sort of were meandering around trying to figure it out, watching different rabbis on YouTube and things. But we'll a lot of them will end up trying to study the Parsha, and we don't really know how deep we should be going. Some will try to go really deep, and I think they get really far out of their league, and they get it completely wrong, and it's a disaster. But to each his own. In my opinion, you should stay under a rabbi, um, because they've been trained to teach it, and you've been trained to understand and can convey it to me properly. If I go at it myself, I could get into a mess really, um, because
Well,
not
so
knowing.
I think in the theme, I guess where we're kicking this off a few uh, weeks, not a few weeks at this point, it's like a substantial number of weeks, but still, we're towards the beginning of the year, but. We didn't start this off with Bereshit, with the beginning of Genesis, but we're still in Genesis. But I think that um, if the idea is to look for things in the Parsha that speak to those kinds of questions, I think turns out to be a good place to start. Because I guess if we're doing this like roughly once every couple of weeks, maybe we want to take in Parshat Vayishlach, which was yesterday, and Vayishev, which is coming up um, at the end of this week. And I think in Vaishlach, there's actually a topic that maybe speaks well to the issue that you just raised, because well, I think the short answer, broadly speaking, in what you raise is that the Torah it has to be thought of as a multi-layered structure, right? Where there's so many different things you can pull out of it, or it's kind of like a kaleidoscope where you turn it and you see something different because you're looking at it from a different angle. Like the same passage will mean more than one thing, and the truth of the Torah is that it means both of those things, and you don't necessarily get them at the same time. But there's also kind of levels of depth where it has things to say that are there, for the taking on the surface, and it has things to say that you have to kind of work for from the text more. I think especially with some of that kind of like digging for wells, right? Like the forefathers, like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they're always, getting well water out of the ground. And Torah in turn is likened to water by the sages and by the tradition, and like water in a desert. And so I think there's kind of an important analogy there that if you're looking for where to dig a well in the desert, the water is deep underground, and you have to kind of be able to see signs on the surface that maybe there's something different going on here and it's worth digging, but then you really have to exert the effort before you maybe can establish that actually, yes, there's, a great source of water there. And I think that studying Torah can work that way. And so I agree that definitely the tradition that has been passed down through the rabbis for centuries, there's just a lot of experience and technique with like spotting those signs.
Hmm.
This is a place where it's worth digging, and here's how you dig, and then you can get to some really significant insights and teaching from Hashem that is there for the taking, but with the appropriate amount of effort. And so, absolutely, I think that that is part of the role of Am Yisrael is to have preserved this tradition of how do you study the Torah and then to be able to teach and to be able to really show what the Torah means. With that being said, I think there's also an important point in Sefer Dvarim, in the book of Deuteronomy, that in the eyes of the nations, the Torah will be a chokhmah. Chokhmah is often translated as wisdom, but I think in the language of the Torah itself, chokhmah is something that you can more specifically link with kind of practical knowledge, meaning you have to have chokhmah as Bezalel has to weave the tapestry in the tabernacle or to pour molten silver and gold to make the implements. It's like craftsmanship. It's like knowing how to do things in the world and get things done. And Yosef, the son of Jacob, he is also associated with chokhmah. He has this knowledge. But if you look at it, and we can talk about it later maybe, he's looking at nature, he's looking at the world and how it works and saying, you know what, I think that actually sometimes we're going to have, more rain or less rain, or we're going to have more crops or fewer crops. He's seeing patterns that are usable. Like when you recognize them, this is how the world works, then you can make use of it and you can save life and you can feed people and things like that. And so I think that there is an aspect of it where when Sefer Dvarim is talking about that, um, and saying that this Torah that Hashem is giving to you, the Israelites, this will be a chokhmah in the eyes of the nations. Like it will show what a wise people you are. I think what it's saying is that there will be a sense in which you can look at it and you can say, it is understandable why, this is what Hashem commands, or it's understandable how blessing comes from this teaching. Um, and it's complicated because I think from the perspective of the Israelites, we're not supposed to keep the Torah because we can rationalize it. Like we're not supposed to say, I want to have rains and crops and lots of productive livestock and healthy children and list all of the blessings that Hashem promises if you keep the Torah. If you think in terms of like, all right, I want to get all those things, and now I can derive what the Torah should be by looking around the world and figuring out what's actually going to help me get those things. It doesn't work that way. You can't. If you're not willing to stand at Sinai and receive revelation, you're not going to figure all this out yourself. And I think it's even also the case that it's not appropriate for Am Yisrael to say, well, I'll keep that mitzvah, that commandment, once I understand what it's used for, what the point of it is, because there has to be this kind of humility of accepting Hashem's law and being willing to, do it. And then eventually maybe you hear something, na'aseh v'nishma, like you do it first and then you hear. But with all that being said, it also is something that you really can look at and kind of understand ultimately where blessing comes from, right? That keeping the Sabbath, for example, like how is it that keeping the Sabbath leads the Jewish people to receive blessing for that? That is something you can study and you can actually kind of figure out, like, oh, I wouldn't have thought that working less might actually make me more prosperous. But there is actually a way of understanding, how that works that isn't magical. And I think that there are a lot of things like that that the Torah is meant to be understood as a teaching where all humanity can appreciate ultimately. Like this is a chokhmah being taught by the world's creator. Like he knows how the world works, and he's showing you how it works, and this is how he wants to teach you about how it works. So I think there's like both of those ideas that yes, of course, you want to connect to understanding of Torah that has, an unbroken tradition that connects back to Sinai on the one hand, and on the other hand, there's also a whole lot to grab onto for all of mankind that is there to be understood of, how this is a sensible and a wise teaching. And then that's something the Torah expects us to understand about it as well. So that's maybe a good preface. Um, so we could talk about Vaishlach and Vaishev a bit, maybe each, but I wanted to start with Vaishlach. So Vaishlach begins at this moment where where Jacob is alarmed at his impending encounter with his brother Esau, and he's afraid that um, Esau was maybe going to try to kill him. Is still angry. He had wanted to kill Jacob when Jacob ran away years earlier, and so there's a lot of dramatic tension, and then it carries on through this ultimately positive encounter with Esau, and then you have a story of Dinah being raped in Shechem and the response of Shimon and Levi. And that it carries on through basically up until the point where you have the death of Rachel in Efrat on the way to Bethlehem. And then we're sort of setting up for the life and times of Yosef beginning in Parashat Vayeshev. The part of Vayishlach that I wanted to bring up was this famous moment where Yaakov is wrestling with this stranger, with this
Mhm.
opponent, who we often talk about as though we know this person's identity. Um, I think there are different ways that you could read it, and they're all kind of necessary in the text. But usually it's talking about Jacob wrestling with an angel. And there's plenty of authentic tradition to support that idea. People also say things like he's wrestling with the angel that represents the nation of Edom, which is Esav. So there's a sense in which it relates to this, upcoming struggle with Esav and his anxiety about the danger that Esav poses to him. Um, but I think that we don't necessarily have to go in that direction. But in any case, I'm more interested in a different issue. I'm sort of skipping to the end of that story, where by the end, at the ford of your book, um, Yaakov is going to wrestle. There's going to be this struggle, and we can read some of the verses. But ultimately, Yaakov talks about it like he encounters the face of God, and what it is to have that encounter with Hashem, and how that's connected with this experience, and how he gets his name, Yisrael of Israel. That's what I think we want to understand, in particular in connection with this thing of this really strange just so story we get for this mitzvah, this commandment not to eat the sciatic nerve meat of a kosher animal, because so let's just read the verses and then we'll talk about all the strangeness and see if we can make some sense of it. So um begins Vayivater Yaakov levado vayevek ish imo ad olot hashachar. So Jacob was left alone, and there wrestled a man with him until the breaking of the day. וירא כי לא יכול לו, ויגע בכף ירכו, ותקע כף ירך יעקב בהיאבקו עמו. And when he saw that he prevailed not against him, he touched the hollow of his thigh, and the hollow of Jacob's thigh was out of joint as he wrestled with him. ויאמר שלחני כי ערה השחר, ויאמר לו אשלחך ki im barachtani. And he said, let me go, for the day breaks. And he said, I will not let you go except that you bless me. So now the sort of famous part where he's given this name, Wayomer lao ma shemecha, Wayomer Yaakov. And he said to him, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. Wayomer lo Yaakov Ye'amer od shimcha, ki im Yisrael, ki sarita im Elohim wa im anashim v'tuchal. And he said, your name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel, for as a prince you have power with God, with men, and have prevailed. sorry, you have power or you have struggled with God, you've striven. Um, and then he asks his name, Vayishar Yaakov Vayomer, Hagida na shemecha, Vayomer lama ze tisha l'shemi, Vayivorech oto sham. And Jacob asked him, tell me, I beg your name. And he said, why is it that you ask after my name? And he blessed him there. Um, and then I'll just, to be a little faster, I'll read through the English up until a point where I want to emphasize the Hebrew. And Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, for I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. Panim or Panei refers to the face, and El is the name of God, so Peniel is the face of God. And as he passed over, and then the text is Penuel instead of Peniel, the sun rose upon him and he limped upon his thigh. Um, Therefore, and this is the strange part that we are going to engage directly with. Therefore, the people of Israel do not eat the sinew of the vein, which is in the hollow of the thigh to this day, because he touched the hollow of Jacob's thigh in the sinew of the vein. Al ken lo yochlu b'nei Yisrael et gid hanasheh. That's what the sinew of the vein is called. Gid hanasheh. Asher al kaf hayerech ad hayom hazeh ki naga b'chaf yerech Yaakov b'gid hanasheh. Okay, so the Gida Nashe is the thing that I'm interested in here, particularly this idea that there's this story from the life of Yaakov that says that's why we have this mitzvah, right? It is a prohibition of the Torah for Jews to eat this particular cut of meat that comes from a particular region of the animal's body, which we're told in the story is kind of the region of the thigh or whatever that Yaakov Avinu got injured in when he was wrestling. And when you're just reading through the Torah, you take it as given, and move on. Okay, that's interesting. And you don't really stop to think, especially if you hadn't read the rest of it, if you were just reading it for the first time, you wouldn't realize this is the only time the Torah talks about a mitzvah this way. That a commandment is derived in the moment from a story. There are other examples that are almost like this, in the sense that you have examples where people go to Moses and ask for a ruling on a
Mhm.
question. Actually, we might return to that because that actually happens basically the same place as this story, much later in the land of Gilad. And I think it is, in a sense, an inheritor of this story. But that is already, a legal court in a sense. They're going to Moses and saying, we need a ruling on this question. It's the story of the daughters of Tzlafchad in the book of Numbers. Um, but before we dive into that, you look around the rest of the Torah, there are multiple cases where there are stories that seem to be the source of a mitzvah. For example, the source of a commandment in the Torah. For example, don't marry two sisters, or if there is a husband and he has two wives, and one wife is snuah, is despised, then he's not allowed to take the son of the beloved wife and favor him over the son of the despised wife. Um, these things sound like Rachel and Leah
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
all the sort of scandal of the family of Yaakov, but it doesn't say in the narrative moment where the story of Yaakov is being told, and that's why we have this mitzvah where you're not allowed to do that. This is the moment where the Torah does that, and it's a very peculiar mitzvah, right? It doesn't seem like it's the most important one, right? Um, this isn't, and that's why we don't murder. This isn't, and that's why we keep the Sabbath. These sort of very significant, profound, central kind of things. And that's why we don't eat this one cut of meat that you almost never would eat anyway. It's related to filet mignon, actually. It's technically possible to make kosher filet mignon, but it requires incredible expertise
Mhm.
of a kosher butcher because there's such a risk of cutting it wrong and then including the Gida Nashed that it's not easy to come by. So it's this expensive, rare cut of meat anyway. And so what is this issue? Why is it? It seems to have outsized importance in the way that it's talked about. This is the moment where Jacob is getting his name as Israel, and it's the one time that we derive from a thing that happens in the life of one of the forefathers that this is now a mitzvah for the nation for all time. Um, and it's about filet mignon. Why is that important? So I think that is a puzzle that leads us to uh, an interesting comment that I think is relevant not just for the Israelite nation or for the Jewish people, but it really is an insight from Torah that is relevant to sort of the broader system view of how is this all supposed to work for all of mankind and um, what's the relationship between mankind as a whole and Am Yisrael. So how do I want to argue that? I think the point of this Gid Hanasheh thing is this sciatic nerve or hollow of the vein or whatever it is, however you want to call it, is that you need to think of it from the perspective of um, a person who wants to eat kosher meat, that they come to the animal, and the first question they have to ask is this a kosher animal? It could be a crocodile, it could be an ostrich, could be a sheep. The sheep will be okay. You can eat the sheep, you can't eat the ostrich or the crocodile. So now if it's a sheep, then you have further procedural rules laid out by the Torah for how it will be appropriate to eat the meat. You have to slaughter it properly, which has to do with how the animal's throat is cut, the knife that's used, etc. It also has to do with pouring the blood on the ground at the time that it's being slaughtered, because there's this prohibition on eating the blood. And also the meat is salted to draw the blood out of the meat. There's a whole set of procedures according to halakha. If you do them right, then you have your properly slaughtered animal and it's a kosher animal and the meat has been kashered with salt and you poured the blood, you did everything right. And it presents this sense of, okay, I did everything right. I followed the law. I kept the Torah. And now I have reached the domain that is just for me to enjoy, right? This is my animal and I slaughtered it and now I have my meat and it's kosher. And now I'm going to have a barbecue. I'm going to enjoy eating it. And I'm done being concerned and careful and making sure that I did things properly. But now that I've reached that limit, it's like I should be able to draw a circle around the whole thing and say, this is mine and this is permitted. And now it's just for me to enjoy eating it. And the Torah comes in and says, well, but actually, within that domain, there's still a piece of it that's not permitted to you. And it's actually a very particularly complexly intertangled piece that makes it really hard to sort of separate and requires, real expertise. And I think the point is that what it represents is the idea of you're never done fully examining the question of whether you're on the right side of the line in how you're serving Hashem, right? That if you approach serving Hashem with the attitude like, all right, I paid at the office, I did whatever it is that I was supposed to do, I checked my boxes, and now I've reached the domain of do whatever you want and it's permitted, and now you can just kind of turn off your brain and uh, be a sort of animal concerned with its own enjoyment. That's a problem. And what this mitzvah, the reason of all mitzvot, that this is the one of all the commandments, that this is the one that's there for Yaakov to be given the name Israel, that he's in this kind of this struggle with Hashem. We can talk about what that means in a second. Um, uh, the reason this mitzvah plays that central role is because that work is never fully done. And so it's kind of trying to show you the sort of Russian doll thing where, like, inside the domain of the permitted, there's still maybe a way of going wrong, and you have to watch out and be careful. And then inside that domain, there's another way that you could go wrong, even once you've been careful about that. And it doesn't ever finish. And that doesn't mean that you're paralyzed or that you never can enjoy anything or that nothing is permitted to you. But it just means that it's about maintaining the awareness of I am always standing before my creator and I am always being judged for how I act. And there even elsewhere in the Torah is this statement, "Ve'asita hayashar v'atov ba'einei Adonai." You should do that which is straight and good in the eyes of the Lord, which is the stopgap basically that says, well, if you thought you were clever and you computed all the dependencies and figured out, well, within these complicated structures of commandments, that there's this kind of loophole here where you can go and do something that's obviously pretty wrong and nasty, but it's technically permitted. It's not. It's not permitted because that's not doing what's straight and good in the eyes of God. And you're expected ultimately to know, like, the whole point of all the commandments is you study them to get to know Hashem. And then really the question you always should be asking yourself is this what Hashem would want me to do? And it is ultimately okay um, to build on your understanding a bit and say, well, if everything I've learned teaches me the following about what it is, who Hashem is and what he wants from me, then I have some ability to say, like, so I think in this situation, this is what he want me to do. And it's not because it's like written down on a page. It's because I've learned something about who Hashem is and what he expects of me. And I think that's why this moment is also where Yaakov or Israel names the place Peniel, the face of God. It's where he encountered God, panim el panim, face to face, because that encounter is about this process, this unending process of refining your understanding of where the boundaries are. And they get more and more intricate and complicated. And you develop more discernment. So you sort of start with, is this a crocodile or is this a sheep? And then it can kind of go from that to, was it slaughtered properly? And you can go from that to, all right, is it a proper part of the animal, or is it the forbidden fat or the forbidden um, kidanasheh or what have you? And so that there's this telescoping sense of the work is never done and you can always improve your understanding, but that isn't just about meat. It's about all the commandments and it's about all the Torah. It's about, that if Hashem is the one God, you can't ever be done getting to know him. You can't ever be done getting to fully understand what it is that he expects. And
Is
and
that
that's why the
also
wrestling thing is also bound up in it. It's like you have to be struggling and it's a process and you're going to get injured along the way because you're going to step your foot wrong and you're not going to be able to figure it out all at one go. And the process of figuring it out is kind of a fearsome one and a dangerous one, which is living life in the created world and finding out sometimes that its creator is not so happy with you. But the point is you come through it with scars perhaps, but with a refined understanding and a sense of like I have seen Hashem in a way that I couldn't have before, because I was open to that continual refinement. You're gonna jump in?
well, I was just going to say, is that it's sort of like in Christianity, they would teach not to use it as a reference, but in this case, I guess they had a point to be temperate in all things. So
Mm,
initially, I mean, ultimately, that's what it is. Really, is having that evil inclination or that animal spirit that wants to, your mouth's watering because you smell the meat, you see the meat, you're ready to eat.
mm,
But hold on, you know, let's have it under control. It's
mm,
a control mechanism from within. You're doing it to yourself. Um,
Yeah, and I think I'm so glad you brought up exactly that point and that topic because I think it's also a very interesting subject, thinking in terms of the common Christian critique of Judaism, and it's important to give an answer to how this looks from within the standpoint of Torah. That a sort of a negative uh, view of Judaism you would get from readings of the New Testament, like the idea of the Pharisees, maybe, is that there's all of this, like, oh, the letter of the law and all of this um, legalism and technicality, and you're losing sight of the spirit of the law. You're losing sight of um, the beauty and the simplicity of the underlying message, and for them it would be all about love and all of that, and I think that um, one does have to treat the subject carefully because on the one hand there is absolutely the idea in Torah of being wicked within the letter of the law, and you shouldn't do that. But it's viewed as a risk. Like it's understood that yes, when you have a complicated legal system, you can be a clever guy. You can bend things this way. You can bend things that way. Um, and or you can just kind of become obsessed with the technicalities and lose sight of that the point of all of this is to do the right thing, even though the Torah tells you just do the right thing. That there is that kind of a risk, and I think that would be the sort of uh, let's say anti-Judaic discourse that you get in certain streams, especially of Christianity. But I think there's you find plenty of it in the New Testament in one way or another, that it's like don't um, miss the real point here, and moreover that the law becomes a burden, that it becomes a veil or a sort of a blinder, and that's why you have to kind of separate from it, step away from it. So what is the answer to that, viewed from the perspective of the Gita Nashe? I think the point is that um, you know one can be wicked um, within any system, right? So if you're determined to be wicked, you can be wicked and you can use your intelligence to do that, wielding the terminology of Torah. You can obviously do that also being a Christian or being whatever else. But let's talk in terms of um, trying to do the right thing. I think that the sort of countervailing critique that you would get from not just Torah, but even from the specific example of Gita Nashe, um, uh, is that trying to do the right thing is not a short story,
mhm.
and that is, the problem with going to the other extreme. So, yes, you can go to some extreme and become obsessed with legal technicalities, and you can lose sight of uh, the essence of what it is to serve Hashem, right? And you can lose sight of doing, what's good and right in Hashem's eyes. On the other hand, you go to the other extreme and you say, no, it's a simple message. Just be self-sacrificing, be loving, and rinse, repeat. Just keep doing that. That's your formula for how you handle whatever situation. There's a subset of situations in which that goes very well. And you get it right. There's a lot of being merciful and being kind that it's easy to accomplish with that kind of a principle. But the world is a more complicated place than that. And from the perspective of this Gita and the Shed thing that we're talking about, it's kind of like saying, well, I'm done getting to know God. This is what He wants from me, and it's a pretty simple rule, and I'll just it'll stand me in good stead always. But the problem is that it won't, because trying to be trying to be always loving and always self-sacrificing can get very ugly and very questionable once you're starting to try to decide, well, how mercifully should I be dealing with, vicious people who are coming to try to destroy me and my people? Um, for example, that's just one obvious example. But it isn't even just, done with that. There's also even just in everyday life, right? Like is trying to earn a living selfish? Is it bad for you to love your children more than you love other people's children? Like these are all the classic questions that I think you can raise in reply to. Actually, there's a simple principle that covers all of this. And the moment you realize that no, there's one God, and He's not summarizable in a short formula, and it takes your whole life to progress towards getting to know Him, and you're going to be, sort of injured and bloodied along the way, just doing your best and struggling and learning, right? That view says that instead of talking about like what happens when someone tries to be wicked or someone isn't doing it right, what does doing it right look like? The point is that if you are sincere and if you are trying to understand through Torah, then you have the ability to keep deepening and improving and expanding and refining your understanding of who Hashem is and what He wants from you. And the Torah becomes the toolkit for doing that because it's like having a vocabulary. If you have only 4 words, then you're going to just kind of go around like a cave person and not say very much to anyone, right? And if you have 100 words, then you can say a lot more. And if you have 1,000 words, then you can say a lot more. And yeah, at a certain point, I don't know if we need 100,000 words, if 1,000 will do, but you do need to be committed to saying different things about different situations and recognizing those fine distinctions. That's the Gita Nashek kind of thing. It's like, what is the boundary between this side of the line and that side of the line? And it does actually break into cases. And what the Torah in its ideal form means to provide is that that toolkit for not finishing the job of getting to know Hashem, and not trying to summarize Hashem as being one simple principle, but instead encountering Him in every scenario of the created world and having a language that's rich enough to capture, what is the difference between this situation where uh, a person promised that he would sell something to someone else, but then his property was destroyed in a hurricane, and now what do you do? And then on the other hand, we have a different situation where someone did sell something to someone, but then took a loan from him afterwards. And like, those things sound sometimes very exhausting in their detail. But I think that's also like maybe a related additional point to make on this Gita and the Shet thing. And this is kind of expanding the view to Am Yisrael versus Bnei Noach in the world, is that it might be appropriate to say that you wouldn't want all of humankind obsessing over the tiniest refined boundary between this piece of meat and that piece of meat, right? Like at a certain point, it can be uh, burdensome, or or at least it takes effort and it takes consideration. And that's why the Torah envisions this division of labor, because it kind of wants the best of both worlds. It wants to be able to say, we need people to be engaged in the world in activities that give everyone a kind of portrait of the unending complexity of getting to know Hashem, right? Like there's always more to understand, there's always more to extract, there's always more to learn, to dig for. And on the other hand, if everyone were equally engaged in that activity, then there's a whole lot that might not get done, and maybe a whole lot that needs getting done to serve Hashem, even that is not going to happen in the same way if there's too much of this devotion of all of mankind's effort to these kinds of considerations. And so I think that's why this also pertains to who is the nation of Israel in contradistinction to the human race as a whole, that it's about, okay, this is a special job. And, for this special job, even the difference between this bit of the animal and that bit of the animal, you should be asking yourself about that and examining that. And then you preserve that mitzvah and you have that sign and you can show it and we can have this conversation. But at the end of the day, that doesn't mean it's just terrible and evil for every person in the world to eat filet mignon. Um, it just it serves a purpose in the context of the role that I'm Yisrael meant to play, but it also uh, is something that you wouldn't necessarily want everyone to be equally concerned with.
Have Have you ever heard of uh, Simcha Yakovovich?
I don't think so.
He's a Jewish freelance investigative reporter from Canada.
Hmm.
He used to have a show on TV in America. I'm not sure where else it was shown, but I know it was in America called The Naked Archaeologist. And he would go around, and it wasn't that he was naked. He called it naked archaeology, sort of as a pun or something about just looking at archaeology without any bias.
Hmm.
But he did it like a documentary where he was attempting to trace down the 10 tribes of Israel that were
Hmm.
supposedly lost. And in the mountains of Pakistan, Afghanistan area, he comes across a town
Ah, yeah,
where
I
it's
am
a group of
familiar.
people.
Yeah,
And
I think it's Afghanistan. Is
he
this
was
theory that the
amazed.
Pashtuns, right? That the Pashtuns are a lost tribe of
I
Israel?
can't remember if it was they were part of it, but this particular one that I was going to reference was he was blown away, and so was I when I was watching it because he was watching this guy that he was slaughtering a beef, and he cuts it a certain way and pulls the sinew,
Mm-hmm.
that sciatic nerve. He knew
Yeah.
how to pull it out. He pulled us the
Hmm.
whole thing out. And he said, "Why did you do that?" And he says, "Well, it's a commandment for us not to eat that. We're not allowed to eat it."
Hmm.
Blew him away, blew me away just watching it that he knew how to
Yeah, yeah.
pull
No,
that.
I think that there is some possibility of that, and it's very um maybe another reason you could say this particular mitzvah gets the top billing that it does in some sense. Dietary restrictions are very deeply ingrained in national culture in a way such that they can be preserved even after the memory of what they mean or what they are has mostly been lost. That there's something very tribal and very, um, oh, I do it this way because some wrestling match that my great great granddaddy had a long time ago. Like there's kind of um, uh, a durability of those kinds of customs um, that is very believable. Yeah, no, I think that's an interesting aspect of it as well. Um,
Well, Dylan, on that subject, and this was something that I guess my humble upbringings when my 21st century farmer brain reads certain passages, it makes a different kind of sense to me, I guess, than what maybe someone that really studies it comes away with. So when I read, you'll not eat this sinew, this nerve or whatever, and that's a memorial for this event.
Hmm.
But then I apply that when I read, you'll not boil a kid in its mother's milk.
Hmm.
I'm reading, okay, is God really worried about me putting a baby goat or a baby lamb in its mother's milk, which I don't know that maybe I think there were some recipes that the Vikings had where they would boil meat in milk, but I don't think that's a common practice. Perhaps it is, but uh, I see that as saying this is a memorial to remind you not to take that what was meant to nourish and to grow and do good and use it to destroy.
Hmm.
But somewhere in the process of time, it just became don't mix meat and cheese or something. You're not allowed to eat a cheeseburger.
Yeah, of
But
course.
the memorial was set in stone to begin with that.
Hmm.
That along the right lines with the memorial of the sinew, sort of.
Well, so I totally agree that the mitzvot, they have many purposes, and in some cases, it's clear that there is a kind of a sensibility that they're trying to, or an awareness that they're trying to bring out in you. Um, and meat and milk is a good example of that, right? Where milk is life, and meat comes from the death of an animal, and it's proper somehow to keep separation between them. And really, it's part of a structure of a larger number of mitzvot, where you wouldn't bring a mother animal and her offspring as sacrifice on the same day, for example, is another commandment in the Torah. Um, Sending away the mother bird. So if you come upon a nest with a mother nesting on her eggs, that you wouldn't like use her desire to protect the nest against her and catch her along with the eggs. So there are these kind of sensitivities to the natural tendency of parents to protect and nurture their children, and not wanting to kind of either disrespect that um, or even exploit it. So you definitely get that from a certain number of mitzvot. I think in the case of Gid and Nashe, if you don't have the story about Yaakov, it's harder to come up with the rationale for it and say, like, what is the lesson here? What is it trying to show us? If you think about the sciatic nerve itself, what does that mean? It's like if we didn't have the story, we'd just be kind of scratching our heads, being like, I don't see the problem. Um, but I wouldn't rule out that someone could come up with another point to make there about what it's for. I think that there's uh, there's definitely other things in the Torah that it connects to. If you look at the word nasheh, I mean, so we talk about there's being like layers of depth. The word nasheh carries you over to other mitzvot where that word seems to be used, like noshe has to do with lending. Um, there's also nashim, which means women. And so there's multiple references kind of to the feminine in the story that are hidden in the text in the Hebrew. For example, when it says that Yaakov is limping, it says he's tzoleya, like the verb for limping is tzoleya, but tzela means rib, like the rib that Eve was made out of. And then the word nasheh is kind of like the word nashim, and also, the place of the injury is sort of connected with the place of uh, being reproductive. Like the word yerech, that, kaf yerech is the thing that's being injured. is referred to. The word yerech is the same kind of yerech where it says like, and from your yerech, your seed will prosper or whatever. Like there are these, like for example, in the mitzvah of the sota, the suspected adulterous woman, it talks about her mm, her thigh, sort of uh, being harmed if the waters of curse affect her, right? And the word is yerech. So yerech is about um, uh, reproduction, maybe about women. All of this stuff is kind of there below the surface. Even the phrase Gida Nashe, when when Yaakov says, "Tell me your name," the Hebrew is Agida Nashemecha. Like Leagid is to tell, and please is na, and shemecha is your name. Agida Nashemecha contains Agida Nashe. And so there's even kind of a play on words there where it's like saying somehow this is about not knowing the name of this person that he's struggling with. And so there are all these hints. It's a very cryptic passage with a lot of puzzles in it, and it's hard to sort of to go through all of that at one go. I do think, like getting back to what we were talking about before, it does strike me that also just the background of this happening around the time of this encounter with Esav is more reason that it makes sense that it's like this is the moment where he's given the name Israel, and this is about the separation of Israel from um, the other nations of the world at some level. And because Esav kind of represents that parting of ways, where it's
Mhm.
like he's the brother that was Jacob's twin, who's not going to become the Israelite nation. And it's interesting because I think we talked in a previous conversation how Esav, because Esav becomes associated with Rome, Esav is also associated with Christianity, um, and that uh, there is even kind of a reference to this whole discussion we're having about the letter of the law and getting into the fine details of things as being about the sort of the identity of Israel as Israel was being established as a separate branch in the tree. Um, and but I think the way you can most see that difference is like with the Gemara, the commentary of the Talmudic sages, tells about the golden rule as it appears in the Judaic tradition, the famous story where a Gentile comes to Hillel and Shammai, these two sages who are famous for having differing opinions, and he says first to Shammai, tell me the whole Torah while you're standing on one leg, um, and I'll convert. I'll become a Jew. The standing on one leg thing does make me think about the sciatic nerve a little bit. Like it's a very weak reference maybe, but part of the issue with the whole Gita Nashed thing is it's like how you walk. Like if you have, problems with that, you're really going to have trouble walking. And so this sort of wobbliness of standing on one leg evokes that a little bit. But so stand on one leg. So Shammai, who's the kind of strict um, uh, legal interpreter generally, he just sort of smacks the guy and sends him away because the idea is like you can't summarize the Torah standing on one leg, and you shouldn't try to. And there's something wrong with the idea of let's summarize this all with a simple principle. Um, and on the other hand, then the same guy goes to Hillel, and Hillel generally is more inviting. And Hillel stands on one leg and he says, that which is hateful to you, don't do to your fellow. Then, but the important thing is he adds, the rest is commentary. Now go and study, right? So this is the Judaic version of the Golden Rule. And the point is that, first of all, you need the whole story. Part of the story is that one answer is don't try to summarize this in one line. And if you're trying to summarize in one line, you just kind of deserve to be sent away because this is a body of knowledge that is equal to the lifelong task of getting to know Hashem better, and so it shouldn't be simple and it shouldn't be easily summarized, on the one hand. On the other hand, Hillel is trying to admit that, yes, actually there is this, be nice to other people aspect of this that we kind of sense is part of the point here. But even because he's doing this in the context of Torah, he has to say, okay, so don't do that which is hateful to you to your fellow, but go study. Like you can't stop there. You have to, and you have to ultimately be willing to put in the effort and deepen your knowledge. And also the whole time he's standing on one leg, which means basically like you give him a little push and he'd fall over. Like it's sort of showing you the instability or the vulnerability of someone who really tries to um, summarize it all
Mm.
with a golden rule or something like that. So that's another thing that
Well,
came to mind.
not to hold you too long, I think we've been going roughly about an hour, but over on the
Mhm.
comments, re Motorhead says he seems to recall that kashrut kosher will change when Mashiach arrives. Is that true?
So I think what's true is that there are multiple disputes in how halacha, how Jewish law should be decided, that are what are called teku, um, which is a very funny word because in modern Hebrew, it's been absorbed into the parlance of modern Hebrew as meaning just like a tie in a football game, is teku. Um, and uh, what it originally referred to in the terminology or in the sort of legal terminology of the sages is when there's like an unresolved dispute. Um, and they had a tradition that it was really an acronym, like an abbreviation for, um, I know that I'm drawing a blank on the whole thing, but it's the taf in Teku is Tishbite. It refers to Elijah the Tishbite. So he's going to come and he's going to resolve the kushiyot. So that's the ka in Teku. Kushiyot is like hard problems, like hard sort of puzzles. Um, so there's this notion that there are some matters of law that haven't been decided fully, and we have to wait for Elijah to come, and it's sort of the fearsome day, which is associated perhaps with the coming of the Messiah, and some of these legal issues will be resolved. Sooner than that, we could reestablish a Sanhedrin, and we could perhaps revisit some issues in Jewish law that have been just sitting still for a couple thousand years. Um, there may be another source that that's referring to, though, about kashrut, and well, I know of at least one thing, which is in Biat HaMashiach. Um, there's a statement by the sages that we will eat the flesh of the Leviathan, like that the flesh of the Leviathan will be reserved for a feast of the righteous. And depending on what kind of animal the Leviathan is, that might require some kind of revision of the laws of kashrut. I'm not sure it's just a fish. Um, but I think that you'd have to go deeper into that statement and what it's really getting at. Um,
I think
but yeah,
was it the book of Yasher that mentions the Leviathan being brought to the mountain of Mount Sinai and the people ate then?
so
Was
I
that in the
I
book
I
of
don't
Yasher?
know
I
the
read that
text
somewhere.
of the book of Jasher well because it's not canonical in Tanakh. It's referred to, interestingly, in
Mhm.
Tanakh, although what is now called that, I'm not sure we know
Yeah, yeah, that's
that it's the same text. Um, but what I know is that there's a midrash, which is like from the sages, where they talk about this idea of um, feasting on the flesh of the Leviathan in the times to come for, a feast for the righteous. Um, and so that's probably kind of their comment on that tradition.
Well, now,
Um,
while I got you, just before you go, I have heard this argument be made by Noahides often
mm,
that the rules on kosher slaughter were just for sacrifice, not for everyday eating of kosher animals. Have you ever heard
mm.
this argument made that?
Well, so I'm comparing different sources in the Torah. There's a specific reference to the idea of, I believe it's in Sefer Dvarim, that when you're far from the temple, like, because the book of Deuteronomy is, over and over again talking about the place that Hashem will choose to make his name dwell there.
Mhm.
So it's really firming up the idea that there's going to be Jerusalem. It doesn't say it's Jerusalem, um, but there's going to be a place which will become ultimately the permanent place where Hashem wants to put his stamp. And you could be pretty far away from there if you live in the land of Israel. If you live way up north, it could be quite a long journey. And so the Torah kind of references that idea and says, like, if you're far from the temple and you want to slaughter animals in your gates, then, you may do that. And, even when doing so, you should still be pouring the blood out on the ground. I'm looking for the reference. I think I'd have to um, dig a little bit because I'm not
Right.
remembering the exact verse off the top of my head. I'll look for it in a second. But let's see. Is it? Yeah,
Well, that can be a do out or something. You can get
yeah,
me.
yeah.
Uh,
Oh yeah, I think I found it. Okay, let's see. This is Deuteronomy 12:21.
12:21.
Um, כי ירחק ממך המקום אשר יבחר אדוני אלוהיך לשום שמו שם, וזבחת מבקרך ומצונך, אשר נתן אדוני לך כאשר ציוויתיך, ואכלת בשעריך בכל עוות נפשך. So if the place which the Lord your God has chosen to put his name there is too far from you, then you shall kill of your herd and your flock, which the Lord has given you as I've commanded, and you shall eat in your gates to your heart's desire. I'll skip a verse that talks about, it mentions also you can eat hunted game like gazelle or deer. רק חזק לבלתי אכול הדם, כי הדם הוא הנפש, ולא תאכל הנפש עם הבשר. לא תאכלנו על הארץ תשפכנו כמים. Only be sure that you eat not the blood, for the blood is the life, and you may not eat the life with the flesh. You shall not eat it, you shall pour it upon the earth as water. So the Sefer Dvarim, the book of Deuteronomy, is explicit about eating meat far away from the temple that's not part of sacrifices. I think maybe someone might be reading Zavachta like um, Zevach. The word Zevach often refers to sacrifices, but it basically just means a barbecue. So, which the sacrifices were. So the idea here is, I mean, it gets a little complicated because there was this period where there was what's called Heter Bamot, where there were just altars all over the land of Israel that were permitted before the temple was established. And so there was this idea of there isn't just one place where you're allowed to do it. And so maybe I'm just trying to understand what the theoretical asker of the question that you mentioned might be getting at. Maybe there are those who, are reading these verses and are kind of thinking what I just read is referring to sacrifices being performed at some other altar elsewhere in the land of Israel. But I don't know. But the halacha I think has been understood pretty
yeah, I mean
firmly to
that
be that.
verse, I'm glad you pointed it out because as I have instructed you, that's pretty straightforward. So there's no no question in that. But the questioner that brought it up to me was they were making the argument, at least because, so unfortunately, sometimes in the Noahide community, you find people that they decide they want to convert to Judaism, but they're very far from a community.
Mhm.
And I'll often tell them, look, it's going to be very difficult. You can't really
Mhm.
do that unless you move to a community. And they'll say, well, we'll just, we'll eat kosher meat. We'll
Mhm.
buy beef and we'll buy. I say, yeah, but if you don't have somebody that's properly trained to kill that animal in that manner, you're really not. Well, their argument is, well, that was just for the temple. That was just for
Mhm.
sacrifice. We can eat the animal. Yeah, and I'm like, no, that's not right. So actually, my instinct was right on that one. That I don't know if I ever read that verse before, or at least maybe something about it was sticking in my head that I knew you had to do it the right way for it to be kosher. So,
Mhm.
but
Yeah, well, it's definitely one of these things about the history of Torah and Jews as a whole, where there's kind of this proof is in the pudding aspect to it, where on the one hand there is some diversity of praxis.
mm,
There have been over the years differences in how rulings have made and what the law is getting at, with this or that wording on the one hand, and on the other hand, um, if that gets too dispersed, then it doesn't become a sort of a viable tradition that can transmit itself. And there needs to kind of be like, there's a living tree, and sometimes it kind of is a judgment of history whether something still is attached to the living tree or whether it's kind of a broken off branch that's off on its own. And that's
mhm,
been true with even Jews who had, very divergent ideas about praxis. Like there were the Sadducees or Stukim, there were the Karaites, there are Samaritans. Like there's people with totally divergent, practices and a number of scores. And you always can kind of make this argument of like, oh, well, how do you know that this is really like what Shem wants us to be doing? And at some level, you have to ultimately say, well, he'll show us,
mm,
and it may just take some time, but um, I think some of those more kind of divergent streams have basically just disappeared from the face of the earth over the centuries, and so. But yeah, there always is. Actually, this reminds me of. I know we probably should finish up soon. We've been going for a while, but we mentioned maybe doing something to do with Parashat Vayeshev from the beginning if we're shooting for once every couple of weeks with this. So just to like make a brief comment for Parashat Vayeshev, I think one thing that it takes up as a subject, interestingly, is how do you know what happened in the past?
mm,
Um, and this is something that we tend to think about a certain way in this present era because of this era of science that we live in, where it's like, well, the way we know about what's in the past is what scientists tell us, and they have their methods. They pick up things off the ground and analyze them, and then they tell us what the true story is. And I'm a scientist. I think science is great. It's very useful. It's a very interesting study. Um, but there actually are some moments in the story of Joseph in Parashat Vayeshev that really show the Torah trying to kind of get us to step back and be cautious about how we use science to talk about the past. Um, because there are two moments in the life of Joseph where someone holds up a piece of evidence in the present and uses it to tell a lie about the past, right? The brothers hold up the bloody coat, and then a very plausible inference is made from that, oh, well, it must be a wild animal attacked him. But really, they're holding up a piece of evidence that is deliberately kind of stacked or sort of tampered with to uh, mislead someone. You go later in Joseph's life, there's another garment of Joseph's actually that again is held up as evidence when the wife of Potiphar grabs it from him, and then she holds it up and said, "Oh, he tried to rape me, and look, I'm holding his garment." Interestingly, the word beged in Hebrew means garment, and the word boged means deceive. There's something about like clothing, like what you see on the outside doesn't always tell you the truth. Um, and this on its own is already kind of just showing you like maybe sometimes you can figure out what happened in the past by picking up a piece of evidence of the present, but you have to be very careful and ask yourself who's making the argument based on the evidence and what's their agenda. And, are they a good faith actor or do they have something they want you to believe as opposed to something that is clearly true? Um, but more generally, it's like you kind of realize you don't really know what happened in the past just because you have a piece of evidence in the present. And you always have to. So you mentioned archaeology before, and I was thinking about it, but this actually does connect back to the other thing about what we were talking about just now with Karaites or whatever. The point is also that in between those two stories is the Torah's answer. Like, what are you supposed to do talking about the past if you're not supposed to pick up evidence off the ground and, reason scientifically about it? What could be another way of knowing about the past? And in between those two stories about Joseph, you have this interlude where it goes to Judah and Tamar. So
Mhm.
what happens with Judah and Tamar? They have this agreement at the time where, he says, "Okay, I'll get you a goat. Right now I don't have my goat, but I'll give you my staff and my seal and my cord as a pledge so that he can partake of her services that she's offering because she's acting the part of a prostitute in that story." Um, and then later, she presents to him his staff and his seal and his cord. And she says, Hakerna, do you recognize these? Interestingly, that phrase Hakerna appears only one other place in the Torah, which is when the brothers present the bloody coat to Jacob. They say, Hakerna, do you recognize this? So, Hakerna, do you recognize the staff, seal, and cord? And the point is there's no way of faking that, right? Because it's not a forensic analysis. It's not like, well, using my scientific technique, I figured out what this staff and this seal and this cord mean. It's a password. It's an agreed upon relationship between parties that is defined to have certain meaning based on certain signs. So even if, in fact, um, she isn't the woman that he slept with, if he sees the staff still in court, he knows that Hashem is showing him a message, all right, because you can't fake that, right? It's like he decided on the terms of the message, and then it comes back to him, and it has clear meaning. Which, by the way, I think is also how the Torah is kind of trying to teach us how you see Hashem's fingerprints in the world. But that's, maybe a discussion for another time. But the point is that that covenantal relationship is how the Torah wants us to talk about the past. So it's like instead of, doing carbon dating or whatever, digging up fragments of things and then seeing who has the most convincing story, you can say, let's talk about the Exodus from Egypt. Let's talk about the forefathers in Canaan. And the way that that truth is going to become clear to you is not because necessarily you're going to find a fragment of pottery. It's because you're going to see the form of that story that you're reading. You're going to see it repeat itself in history. You're going to see it repeat itself in your life. You're going to see it in the future. You're going to be able to predict the future because you read about the past this way. And that's how the Bible is really asking you to authenticate its truth. So it's like this observation about Tamar and Judah is my wife made to me for the first time I heard it, and it's always been one of my favorite things in all of Tanakh that in between these moments where you have lies being told with, let's say, archaeology or CSI, kind of forensics, whatever, that in between you have the covenantal truth, the promise and the pledge and the password and the contract And that's how Hashem wants to talk to us through history, and He shows us how to read the signs by teaching us about what happens with the avot. So I think that ultimately is also the answer about how do we know what we're supposed to do? How do we know that we're supposed to sacrifice sheep and not iguanas? It's about tradition, right? It's about that you have a connection based on signs from one generation to the next that goes all the way back, and that there's a shared language and a shared framework of meaning that creates this chain of transmission that connects you back to Sinai, and that's really what all these mitzvot and laws and traditions are all about.
Someone wanted me to mention Lubavitcher Rebbe's book, Mind Over Matter, Science and
Mhm.
Torah. Are you familiar with that?
I don't think I've read a whole book by him on this subject. I'm familiar with maybe some fragments of pieces of writing people have shown me over the years on the topic. Um,
You on the two parshas, what would be the takeaway for Noahides really? That not necessarily any application for Noahides in the sense of a new rule or law or anything we need to follow, but for educational purposes, I guess we could say this is part of the growing pains for the establishment of the nation of Israel. This is some of the growing pains they go through, key points, key events in the growing up of a nation that's going to be set aside for a purpose. Is that really what we should take away from it? Um,
well, there always are many things to take away. I think in Genesis, in Sefer Bereshit, there's a lot more that's kind of there on the surface for the taking, as far as these aren't stories entirely about Jews or the Jewish people even. They're stories about individuals and a family in a time kind of before the Jewish people came into being entirely, where they were having experiences that were very human experiences of living in the created world and seeking their creator and trying to understand what he wanted of them. And I think um, with Jacob and what we're saying with like wrestling and finding the face of Hashem, I think that's clearly a very universal message at some level, that it's everyone's opportunity to seek to know Hashem and come to a more refined understanding of what He wants from them, but that there's something fundamentally protracted about that it's you can't do it all at once. It's like a process of struggle that takes effort, that it can leave you uh, feeling scarred, or it can take you through um, injury and difficulty along the way, but that kind of uh, knowledge and encounter is possible if you approach the tribulations of life with that as the end goal, right? If it's like, oh, well, this is how Hashem is helping me to get to know Him, and of course that doesn't exhaust the subject, but if that's the your understanding of that being the end goal, then that carries you through in a different way than if you just kind of are saying, I'm just trying to win, right? Like I need to win the wrestling match. I need to defeat all the sort of things standing in my way. And maybe I will and maybe I won't, but what could be better than winning? What could be better than winning is eventually realizing that Hashem is trying to help you to get to know Him. And that's what this is all about. And I think that's certainly not something that is about the experience of the Jewish people only. It's about the experience of mankind as the image of God, the partner in dialogue that Hashem created. And the Jewish people are here in a sense to preserve the memory of that so that it can be taught to everyone, right? The same way we're remembering don't eat this part of the sciatic nerve or whatever. But and then on the subject with Vayeshev, when you get over to Joseph, I think it's even more like it's about politics. It's about um, uh, economics. There's a whole lot in the story of Joseph, which we can also pick up in a couple weeks because it keeps on going into Parashat Miketz. Um, it's a fascinating story that has a lot of dimensions to it. But I think that one of the things, since I'm a scientist, that I love to talk about with Joseph is how I kind of think he is a scientist, um, and that provides you with a way of getting a very careful comment from the Torah on how to view science. Because on the one hand, it's like useful, and on the other hand, somehow Joseph ends up enslaving everyone to a god king at the end of the day, and maybe he doesn't get it right so much, or maybe just listening to the guy who can predict the future using science doesn't necessarily always lead to the right place. So we can have a longer discussion about that when we are talking about Joseph next time, Bezrat Hashem.
The stories of Jacob and Joseph, and they're very real in a lot of ways. I mean, it's nearly every day you see someone in a position of power that wanted to use that power to influence or abuse someone under them. As a matter of fact, there was some, and it's not always a man doing that to a younger woman or something. I mean, I just seen some news articles of female teachers that were having relations with boy students, So it's very real, Joseph's position he was in.
Hmm.
But when you read about him or Jacob it's like God shows you that he's taken people that are not perfect. They're not perfect people. They make mistakes. They get into a situation, but because they're willing to, I guess, stand on certain principles, it makes them something he can work with. They have something in them that's different that he can work with. He sees it in them.
Yeah, and if you look at the trajectory of his life, I think what's so stunning about Joseph is that he, because he's committed to righteousness and doing the right thing, HaKadosh Baruch Hu puts him in terribly difficult circumstances. Um, and he's given the opportunity to stand tough. And you never would think that getting thrown in prison was on a direct path to becoming essentially king over the land, right? He ultimately is in this position of unmatched power and importance and glory. And he would never have ended up there if he hadn't been thrown in prison.
Mm,
And he's thrown in prison because he does the right thing. And so it's like, all right, if you're planning your career, I want to be king over Egypt. You don't say, all right, step one, put me in prison, right? But HaKadosh Baruch Hu holds all the cards, and so he can say, okay, I know how righteous you are. I'll give you a chance to do the right thing and to do the right thing to your own detriment, and it's going to ruin your life. But it turns out that's the only way for you to become king over the land and save everyone. So, that's how I've decided it's going to be.
yeah, and I look back at my journey uh, from where I was 25 years ago till now, and the things I went through. Uh, God, no doubt, knew what it took to get my attention. I'm just as hard-headed as anybody, and had my worldview that was not. You couldn't change that. That was the way I was brought up, and that was what I believed, and I was willing to gamble my life on it. But through a series of events, he opened my eyes, and I think possibly that's what Joseph had to go through. It was part of what Hashem knew he for his personality, for what he wanted him to be. This is what I need him to do. He has to start out here, and
Yeah,
possibly
it's one of
unbelievable
the
God.
most difficult things to understand. Like even if you can understand it intellectually, I think emotionally, we all have things we go through that are difficult in life, especially as we live more and more of it. And when you look at Yosef, there's something very sad and very hard about his story because I don't know, you could say, all right, maybe he has a very hard time in the beginning because he's kind of being punished for something, and you can read that into it and try to explain that way, but I don't know. Let's say he's being punished for something. You think you figure that out, a few years into this whole like being made into a slave and then thrown in prison. And then it's like, okay, so he's repented his sins, and then what? He still has to spend another X years in prison. He's not getting out the moment that he figures that out. And also, sometimes like those Baruch Hu, it's not even about like, oh, I'm punishing you for something necessarily. It's about just like, what you need to
Growing
become.
process.
Like
Yeah.
he has a use for you, and there's a way you become what he plans for you to be. And it's like, forging metal. It's like how the Torah describes the bondage in Egypt as being a kur barzel, like an iron crucible in which Am Yisrael were forged. So it's like, well, I need you to be this. And the way my world works, this is how you become what you got to be. And it's not an always pleasant, but it'll get you to the right place. And it'll test you. And like, I want to test you because I want you to show your mettle. I want you to show who you are and what you can do. And that's not going to be possible if I give you an easy time. And you can understand all of that intellectually. And then when you're still in the middle of the painful parts of life, that'll only get you so far. And it's still painful and it's still hard. And I
I,
don't know. I think about Yosef a lot because I think like, how do you do the back end of however, what is it, 13, 17 years in prison, however long he's in prison, I forget. Um, how do you do the second half of that after you've like you've really achieved you've made a lot of strides in your understanding of yourself, and you've done tshuva, you've repented, you've gone to all your practical efforts to politic with the other people in the prison and talked about dreams, and then it's still going to take some time. And you gotta be willing to wait for Hashem and learn that it happens on his timetable.
I'm just speculating, but when I read, how he bragged about his dream to his brothers that he would rule over them, I think there was more to the bragging than what's given in the text. Sort of, kind of just
Hmm.
he was just saying that he dreamed that he ruled over them. No, there must have been more to it to make them so angry that they threw him in a pit. So it may have been
Yeah.
this boasting attitude that he had. Perhaps he was a spoiled brat because he was favored so much by dad. And
Yeah.
that
Or
prison
you could
time was,
even be more favorable and you could say, maybe he is this genius and we can talk about this next time, but he was right. Not
Mhm.
just that he would rule over them, but he was really saying arguably something a little subtler. He was saying, look, I'm going to be a better farmer than you. And I'm going to, I know how to be a better farmer because I look at the stars and the sun and the moon, and I can tell time. I know when to plant and when to reap. So do what I say, and we'll all be better off because we'll eat better and we won't starve. And he could be right about all of that. But if his attitude was, I'm a genius and you have to listen to me,
Yeah.
then there's something, there's a problem with that attitude, even if everything in that statement is true, that he had to learn this kind of humility.
Mhm.
Um, but Chazal have this really wicked midrash, this homiletic tale they tell, which I'm not going to quote exactly, but like when he finishes telling the dreams of the baker and the vintner, he pleads with the vintner or the cupbearer of Paro, when you get out of here, tell Paro about my case because I'm here innocently, and I need to get out of here. And what Chazal say is that when he asked the vintner for that, Hashem added 3 more years to his sentence or something. And it's that just that always is like a punch in the gut for me because I feel like, oh, but I think the reason is it's not obviously there's a way of reading it where it's like, oh, he showed a lack of faith and he tried to get out through help from Paro instead of trusting in Hashem. But I think that's kind of a first level reading of it. Yes, it's true. You shouldn't trust in great kings. You should trust in Hashem. But you still have to actually try to do stuff in the world. Like if you um, refuse to walk out of a burning building because you're saying, no, I want Hashem to save me. I don't want to walk out of the burning building myself. Like, why? I don't want to trust in my legs. I'll trust in Hashem. Then maybe maybe you deserve what happens next, for that level of stupidity. So you can't really fault Yosef for saying, all right, let me think about how to get out of here. But I think the point is more this, that it's not that Hashem added 3 years to punish him arbitrarily. It's more like, okay, so you figured out how to get out of here, but you know what? That way of getting out of here takes 3 years. I'm not gonna, it's like if the way he figured out of there was that some baby had to be born, that would take 9 months. And Hashem wouldn't make it be born in a month just because Yosef was ready and he was deserving or something. Some things take time and they take the time that they take. And Kadosh Baruch Hu knows much better than we do sometimes how much time they need to take.
I can definitely sympathize with the learning curve. Part of this, I guess you would say, waking up thing, and then you want to share that knowledge with everybody, and they look at you like you're crazy, and you realize you just got to shut up and learn more, and in time you learn how to talk to them where they'll receive it. You can't go screaming at them, look, this is wrong, this is wrong, and they're just like, get out of here. I don't want to hear.
That's even the life of Moshe Rabbeinu, right? Like he tries. He gets to know his people, and then he's out there. He kills the Egyptian. He's intervening in the fights going on between the Hebrews and telling them, "Look, listen to me." They're like, "What? You want to be our judge?" And then even when he has to run away, he's like, "Okay, so maybe I should try to, get involved in other people's fights and stuff." And he has such an impulse to justice, and that's why Hashem chooses him for his task. But he has to age to 80 herding sheep before he really starts his career, right? Because he had to like cool off somehow, and get some perspective, get some other kind of relevant experience.
Well, thank you, Rabbi. Thank you for your time. Sorry to keep dragging you out here.
No, not at all. It's a pleasure.
No sweat.
Absolutely. I'm glad we're starting this. B'ezrat Hashem, I think it'll be a lot of fun.
Absolutely. Yep. Thank you for joining. Thank you for your lessons. Thanks everyone for joining this late this evening. So, uh,
Thank you for all your thoughts and ideas as well. Nice talking. Take care. Cool
see you
too.
next time.
Shalom.
Shalom, shalom. We hope to do this once every other week if everybody can join. So every other Sunday do a sort of a Parsha recap. So time permitting. So all right. Well, thanks everyone for joining. Take care.